You won't believe these numbers, but these are real. Thousands of tanks gone. Hundreds of aircraft wrecked. Almost 1 million Russian soldiers dead, wounded, or missing. This isn't a war anymore, it's a collapse. And the man responsible for it all, Vladimir Putin. What started as a military campaign has turned into a meat grinder, grinding down not just equipment, but the myth of Russian power. Russia is running out of troops, running out of weapons, and running out of time. Let's break down the numbers that prove beyond all doubt that Russia is done. On April 29th, the Kyiv Independent published an in-depth report into the sheer scale of Russia's manpower losses since Putin launched his full-scale invasion in February 2022. Those losses are massive. In just over 3 years of war, Russia has lost a staggering 950,860 soldiers to death, injury, or capture. That amounts to roughly 317,000 soldiers per year in a war that's been a gruesome meat grinder ever since the initial flash invasion ended. It gets worse for Russia. Accompanying these ridiculous troop losses, which are the largest Russia has experienced in a single engagement since World War II, Putin's faltering invasion has taken a massive bite out of the country's equipment stockpiles. A staggering 10,728 tanks now lie in ruins on the battlefield. The majority of those tanks are old Soviet-era vehicles. Before the war, it was believed that Russia had around 3,300 operational tanks. Practically all of those tanks are gone. The extra 7,000 or so that have since been lost were much older models that have been mothballed for decades, with Russia now having burnt through those to the point where it's left with the dregs. The story is the same no matter where you look. Over 22,300 Russian armored vehicles have been reduced to dust in Ukraine. Putin has managed to lose 46,432 other vehicles and fuel tanks, along with more than 27,000 of his artillery systems and 1,373 of Russia's multiple-launch rocket systems. Ukraine has taken out 1,146 of Russia's air defense systems, carving pathways through Russia for its drones and other aerial assets in the process, and has decimated 370 Russian warplanes and 335 of Putin's helicopters since February 2022. The supposedly dreaded Black Sea Fleet is also a shambles. Once seen as a key to Putin's strategy in the south and eastern Ukraine, that fleet has now lost 28 of its ships and 1 of its submarines. It's also unable to replenish itself with other naval assets. Just weeks after Putin invaded, Turkey instituted an international law preventing warships from any nation from sailing into the Black Sea. Turkey is the gatekeeper for that stretch of water. It controls the Straits of the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, which connect the Black Sea to the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. Turkey made those routes no-go zones for Russian warships. The Black Sea Fleet is crumbling as a result. Even on the drone front, Russia is struggling. Putin has relied on unmanned aerial vehicles to support his rampant missile and bombing campaigns in Ukraine. The result is that 34,177 drones have been decimated by Ukraine, demonstrating that even when Russia innovates and changes its tactics, it still experiences massive losses. Don't underestimate just how impactful these losses have been on Putin's efforts in Ukraine. Each lost soldier or piece of equipment weakens Russia's military, and with that weakening comes a lowered ability to conduct the ground assaults on which Putin has relied since his invasion developed into an attritional war. Weaker Russian forces can't attack as strongly. They're also easier for Ukraine to pick off, which is one of the reasons we're seeing such massive numbers today. If you need any convincing of these facts, we only need look at 2 things: how much Russia sacrificed to gain the territory it stole from Ukraine in 2024, and what that has meant for Putin's faltering efforts to snatch more land so far in 2025. On May 5th, the BBC published an interesting report. It claimed that 45,287 Russians were killed in 2024. Those figures are low, especially when compared to those the Kyiv Independent shared a few days earlier. There's a good reason for this. The BBC is using figures of confirmed kills, whereas the Kyiv Independent shares numbers based on Ukraine's own reporting of Russian casualties. According to Ukraine, the real number was closer to 430,000 Russian casualties in 2024, though it doesn't say how many of those 430,000 were killed versus being captured or injured. Even the BBC is aware of the disparity, stating that its death numbers may only cover between 45 and 65% of the actual Russian deaths that have occurred in Ukraine. Either way, these numbers reveal something interesting about Russia's Ukrainian territory capture rates and the losses it's absorbing to take land. The BBC claims that its conservative figures mean that Russia lost 27 of its soldiers to death for every square kilometer of Ukraine it managed to take in 2024. That amounts to 27 deaths per 0.38 square miles. Those losses included over 3,400 of Russia's airborne troops, along with 1,400 Marines and 600 of its Special Forces soldiers, and 132 of its Federal Security Service agents. That's a lot of specialists lost for a relatively small land grab. Transplant Ukraine's figures for 2024 onto these territorial gains and they become even worse reading for Putin. Ukraine's reports of 430,000 losses divided by the BBC death figures of 45,287 gives us 9.49. Multiply that by the 27 deaths the BBC reports per 0.38 square miles gained by Russia in 2024, and you get around 256 Russians being lost to death, injury, or capture for every 0.38 square miles Putin managed to grab in Ukraine in 2024. Again, the numbers don't lie. Putin burned through huge chunks of his military's manpower, along with many of its most experienced and talented soldiers, to reach a point where it controlled around 20% of Ukraine by the end of 2024. That's simply not sustainable. But we'll get to that in a moment. This massive weakening of Russia's military from a manpower perspective has had clear knock-on effects for Putin's campaign. 2025 has been a terrible year for Russia so far on the territorial gains front. In April, Al Jazeera shared a pair of reports, one created by the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, and the other by the UK's Ministry of Defence, or MOD. Both show us that Russia's territorial gains have slowed dramatically in 2025. The ISW's figures make for slightly better reading for Putin. It says that Russia managed to grab 165 miles of Ukraine in January, with the number falling to 137 square miles in February, before almost bottoming out at 78 square miles in March. In other words, Russia saw its territorial gains sliced by more than half during the first 3 months of 2025. Britain's Ministry of Defence figures are even more damning. They say that Russia only snatched 126 miles of Ukraine in January, followed by 76 in February, which is already lower than the ISW's March figures, and only 55 square miles in March. April wasn't much better. According to Euromaidan Press, it says that Russia captured 68 square miles of Ukraine in that month, placing it squarely between the ISW and MOD's March figures. In other words, there was no improvement. But there were still huge losses. What we see here is that the transition from winter into spring hasn't meant much for Putin's forces. Where they should be increasing the strength of their offensives, they're actually getting weaker, to the point where they're claiming less territory per month now than at almost any point during the invasion. All of this links back to the huge Russian loss figures we shared earlier. Frankly, it's all very logical. With over 950,000 Russian soldiers lost, including huge swathes of the country's veterans and military specialists, Russia's attacks in 2025 have grown so weak that Putin can do little more than throw soldiers at Ukraine's defenses in the hope they'll break through. Those soldiers are far weaker than the ones Putin had in 2022. They've not been trained as well, and they're often conscripts and contracted troops that don't want to be in Ukraine. Combine that with Russia's worsening equipment situation and you get a fighting force that's doomed as Putin depletes his military daily. It all adds up to one thing. The rest of 2025 is also going to be terrible for Russia. Why? Well, we have even more numbers. On May 3rd, Euromaidan Press shared Russia's casualty rate for the first 4 months of 2025. It's huge, even bigger than what we saw in 2024. So far, the outlet says, Russia has lost 160,000 of its troops to death, injury, or capture during the year. Multiply that number for the first third of 2025 by 3 and you get a potential loss rate of 480,000, which is 50,000 more soldiers lost than in 2024. Again, we see a demonstration of the decimation of Russia's military at play. Putin's attritional strategy was supposed to deplete Ukraine's numbers, not his own. Let's do some more maths. If we use the ISW's more conservative territorial gain figures for the first 3 months of 2025, we get 380 square miles. Tack on Euromaidan's figure of 68 square miles for April, and you get a total of 448 square miles at a cost of 160,000 soldiers. That amounts to 357 soldiers lost per square mile of territory gained, which is even higher than the number of soldiers lost per mile reported by the BBC for 2024. If we expand these figures to the rest of 2025, Russia is only going to have grabbed around 1,140 square miles of Ukraine in return for its highest annual losses yet for the war. That simply isn't sustainable. According to the official website of Ukraine, Putin's target is 233,030 square miles. Russia had grabbed around 20% of Ukraine's land by the end of 2024, meaning approximately 46,606 square miles of Ukraine are under Russian occupation. That leaves 186,424 miles to go as of the beginning of 2025. If Russia is on track to claim just 1,140 square miles in 2025, that means it'll take Russia's forces another 163 years to fully occupy Ukraine at its current rate of advancement. Of course, there are caveats to these numbers. If Russia manages to take Kyiv, the rest of Ukraine likely falls. Putin may also intensify his country's attacks later in the year, as he did during the first few months of 2024, leading to more land grabs, though likely at the cost of even more troops and equipment. Even so, over a century of war, for a supposed special military operation that was supposed to last a few days. Russia is absolutely done, even if it wins in Ukraine. The sheer scale of its losses over that period would be such that the country would become a shell of its former self. The same would be true of Ukraine, of course, but Russia's weakness resulting from Putin's terrible approach to this war would leave it a non-factor on the geopolitical stage. If the country didn't collapse in on itself, it would be easy pickings for the likes of China to manipulate, along with being no particular threat as an enemy to the United States once the Ukraine war is done and dusted. Still, maybe it's not as bad as it seems for Russia. Perhaps Putin is suddenly going to develop into some sort of tactical genius and come up with a way to start making gains again while losing fewer soldiers. If he is, then he needs to start doing it fast. Russia's daily casualty figures still make for terrible reading, showing us that despite all of these losses so far, Putin clearly doesn't have a plan B. Rewind to April 27th and we see a worrying pattern emerging for Russia. On that date, the country lost 1,030 of its soldiers, along with 8 of its tanks to Ukraine's stalwart defense. That 24-hour period also saw 42 of Russia's artillery systems go up in smoke. Those daily numbers are bad, but they were about to get worse. On May 3rd, Russia's troop losses rose to 1,170 in a single day. The country also lost 6 more artillery systems than it did on April 26th. Still, there was something for Putin to smile about. He only lost 4 tanks on May 2nd rather than 8. Move on to the next day and the numbers just keep getting worse. A staggering 1,340 soldiers dead or injured, 11 tanks gone, along with a pair of warplanes that were shot out of the skies over the Black Sea by drone boats armed with American AIM-9M missiles. Perhaps you're starting to see why Russia's total losses are as massive as they are. You may also be starting to see a pattern. Russia's daily losses covering the end of April and into early May are going up at a time when Putin's forces are claiming less and less territory in return for those losses. It's all fuel to add to the Russian doom fire. Plus, these daily losses show that Putin is out of ideas. He can't stem the tide. Thousands more Russians are going to be dead before the end of 2025. Still, there's one bright spot for Russia. It's finally managed to kick Ukrainian forces out of Kursk. In August 2024, Ukraine launched a bold counter-invasion into Kursk that saw its forces take a substantial amount of Russian territory. The move was massive at the time. By holding some of Kursk, Ukraine gave itself leverage to use in future peace talks. It also delivered both a lesson and a massive humiliation to Putin by showing him that his forces were no longer safe in their own territory. Fast forward to April 27th and Russia was claiming to have finally eliminated Ukraine from Kursk. One of the country's top commanders said that date marked the recapture of the final village Ukraine held. Putin praised both his own soldiers and the heroism of the North Korean troops Russia enlisted to help it retake Kursk in the aftermath. By the way, the fact that Russia had to use North Korean troops at all is another sign that the country is struggling with a manpower problem. Still, Russia had a major victory to crow about, even if Ukraine says that Russia's celebrations are premature. As Reuters points out, reclaiming Kursk removes one of the biggest barriers to negotiating a ceasefire that Russia had in place. Ukraine lost its leverage. Even if it's still fighting in Kursk, there's no denying that Russia has retaken most of the oblast. Should the two come to the table now, Ukraine can no longer use Kursk in a territory exchange. What does any of this have to do with Russia being done? Well, it all comes back to the casualties issue. Putin sacrificed a lot of his country's soldiers to retake Kursk. On the same day that Russia declared its victory, Ukraine revealed that 62,400 soldiers had been struck down in Kursk since Putin started his effort to retake the oblast in late 2024. Of those losses, 25,200 were irreversible, meaning those people died. The other 36,200 soldiers were injured. Add 983 troops that Ukraine took prisoner, and you get a massive casualty rate for a relatively small patch of Russian land. Most of the casualties were Russian, said Ukraine. Only 4,500 of the 10,000 or so North Koreans fighting in Kursk were killed or injured, meaning around 58,000 of the dead or injured came from Russia. Now here's the kicker. Putin dedicated 50,000 soldiers to the Kursk counteroffensive. Not only has he lost all of those soldiers, but he managed to burn through over 12,000 more before he could retake the oblast. For Russia, that means Kursk is a hollow victory. Putin planned to move on from Kursk into a full-blown offensive against Ukraine's Sumy Oblast. Russia is still attempting that offensive, but as you saw from the terrible territorial gains numbers we shared earlier, it's not getting very far. It can't. Putin was relying on whatever was left from the Kursk force to continue the fight in Sumy. Practically nothing is left. And that's the big problem Russia is facing on every front of the war. Russia is running out of manpower, and that's why it's doomed. So how is Putin trying to solve this problem? For one, he's relying more heavily on foreign mercenaries now than he has at any point during his invasion. The Guardian reports that Moscow is actively advertising for these mercenaries in countries such as China, where it's using social media to offer sign-on bonuses going up to about $27,875, along with monthly salaries of around $2,500. Russia says it wants tough men in these ads. What it really means is that Putin is willing to pay through the nose for foreign bodies to feed into his meat grinder because he's running out of Russians who are willing to fight for him. Putin has also turned to criminals. New laws introduced in 2024 allow Russians facing criminal prosecution to trade their possible sentences for service in the military. The Moscow Times suggests that the measure will deliver around 25,000 soldiers, which based on current figures should last Russia about 3/4 of a month. And Putin needs to take these drastic actions. The reason? Recruitment inside Russia isn't anywhere what he needs it to be if his military is to sustain its massive losses. How bad recruitment is going depends on the source. The new Voice of Ukraine says that Russia is hiring between 8,000 and 9,000 contract soldiers per month. That amounts to 130,000 per year, which is less than a third of the country's projected losses for 2025. Euromaidan Press paints a slightly better picture for Russia by stating that it's pushing through about 30,000 new troops per month. The disparity might be explained by Russia forcing conscripts into the fight, but even with those higher numbers, that only amounts to 360,000 for the year, 120,000 less than Russia is going to lose if it continues on the same path that it's on right now. Regardless, the optics are bad. Russia is hiring as many mercenaries as it can get its hands on while introducing criminals into its military. Even with these desperate measures, it's not recruiting anywhere near enough soldiers to make up for the ever-growing losses it's experiencing in Ukraine. The numbers don't lie. Russia is close to done on the manpower front. Combine that fact with the massive equipment losses we mentioned right at the beginning of the video, and there's only one conclusion. Win or lose in Ukraine, Putin has doomed his military to a crisis from which it may take decades to recover. But what do you think about Russia's enormous losses during the war? How long can Putin sustain this approach before he's forced to rethink? Is Russia's leader even capable of coming up with a plan B? Let us know your opinions in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more commentary on the plight of the Russian military and the amazing successes Ukraine is having against Putin's invading forces.